So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of two training webinars that Integrated Waterbird Management and Monitoring is hosting this summer and early fall. My name is Linda Wires, and I am the project coordinator for IWMM. I'm a contractor with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, just to introduce myself, and I work with refuges out of the regional office in Region 3. So before we get started here, I'd like to remind everyone, as Tim has done a couple of times, that this webinar is being recorded. So if you haven't put your phones on mute, now is the time to do that. We want to get through the presentation without any interruptions, but rest assured we're going to provide lots of time at the end of the presentation for questions and discussion. So if we could, yes, thank you. So as we noted in the invitation email for this webinar, IWMM's bird and habitat monitoring protocols were revised in February of 2015. In addition, IWMM has also been working on building an online database that's going to be a node of the Avian Knowledge Network, and this database is going to make it much easier for users to enter and share their data, get reports, etc. So IWMM is planning on implementing and transitioning users to the new protocol and the database for the upcoming field season. Hence the reason for this webinar, which is the first of a two-part series to introduce you to our new products. While we are updating you with these changes, we also wanted to take the opportunity to introduce the IWMM program to a wider audience and highlight some of the benefits of using these tools more broadly. So if you're new to the IWMM program or you're considering using the IWMM approach, we're going to provide some information today about the program that will help you gain an understanding of how it might help you move towards your monitoring and management goals for waterbirds and their habitats. So the outline for today's webinar is going to include the following. We're going to provide a general overview first of the IWMM program, and then we're going to give you a detailed overview of the habitat and bird monitoring tools and how they've changed. We'll then give you a preview of our new database, and some highlights of this, and then we're going to present some highlights from a case study for local scale decision support that we've developed for one refuge, Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge, which is located in coastal North Carolina. We're also going to provide an example of what can be done with the standardized local scale data that we're collecting once they're aggregated to look at questions at larger scales. Finally, end with a good 20 to 25 minutes for questions and discussion at the end. So I'd like to introduce the other IWMM staff that are on the line today, going to be presenting and assisting with the webinar. So in addition to myself, the individuals that are presenting include John Stanton, who works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Birds in Region 4, and he's going to present the overview of IWMM, give you a preview of the database, and he'll also present the local case study that was done for Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge. Brian Logis is on the phone. He works for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Refuges, Region 3. He's a zone biologist. He'll present protocol revisions. Also having Kevin Agard online with us today. He's a postdoc at the Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center, working at USGS, and he'll present an example of our collective data analysis. Finally, we have Tim Jones on the line, who's helping us out with technical support and can answer some of the more technical questions that may arise. Tim is working for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Birds in Region 5, and he's the leader of the IWMM technical team. So with those introductions, I'm going to hand things over now to John Stanton, who will begin by providing IWMM.
This is to introduce the overview section of the webinar, and we recognize that some of you may know less about this program than others, so we thought we'd begin with a basic overview of how the program was developed to meet the needs of waterbird managers and decision makers. The idea of IWMM arose organically in 2007 as a grassroots effort, recognizing the need for standardized and coordinated effort to aid in the acquisition, restoration, and enhancement of wetlands during the non-breeding period for water birds. by providing managers with a framework and tools to guide their management, evaluate their outcomes of their efforts, and incorporate collective learning to improve decision-making. Natural resource managers were counting water birds in a variety of ways and times. Years and years of count data have been collected and in many cases ended up in filing cabinets. The focus of IWMM is water birds, and specifically we're referring to waterfowl, shorebirds, and long-legged waders during migration and over winter, what we define as the non-breeding period. Staff from the Service's Refuge Program, migratory birds, state fish and game agencies, and other conservation partners were involved in the development of IWMM since its inception. The effort initially focused on the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, and you might ask why these flyways? Because these are where the staff who attended the early workshops. However, we did reach out to the other flyways to let them know what we were working on. We did not want to overextend ourselves in the beginning, but we agreed to keep people posted as we move forward. A team, what we call AKA the IWMM Science Team, is comprised of members from the original grassroots efforts, and they identified three main questions and the need for decision support relative to water bird habitat management and decision making at these three spatial scales. The questions included, at the flyway scale, where, when, and how much habitat for water birds. At the regional scale, where should funds and staff be allocated for acquisition, restoration, or management activities? And at the local scale, the question was, how do we optimize habitat management strategies for water birds? Answers to these questions need to be supported by a base of monitoring and modeling. This multi-scale approach was supported by the basis of the monitoring of water birds across the landscape. In doing so, we are able to link water birds and habitat conditions along with modeling to improve decision-making and our ability to manage for water birds across a large landscape. Over the next 7 years since the inception, IWMM and the team worked to develop tools in multiple areas and now have well-developed approaches for the flyway scale decision support, local scale decision support, and monitoring protocols and data management tools. Additionally, in 2014, IWMM was given an administrative home with the Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Resource Program Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. This is a very significant milestone for IWMM because it provides funds for a permanent full-time science coordinator, currently in the process of hiring a science coordinator right now. And also that provided for a contract position, a project coordinator. In addition, this adoption by the Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge System formally recognized IWMM as a significant platform for biological planning. As noted earlier, one focus of our webinar today is to introduce you to our newly revised monitoring protocols. These protocols enable managers to track and link water bird use, habitat conditions, and management actions for water birds during the non-breeding season. This is the only protocol we're aware of for water bird conservation that tracks all three elements for non-breeding water birds. It standardizes water bird and habitat monitoring for potential aggregation at larger scales. It can be integrated into local scale decision frameworks. It evaluates management actions. It allows you to update parameter estimates for modeling and models that have been built, and allows for the testing of alternative models. To arrive at the current protocols, IWMM conducted a lengthy pilot phase from 2010 to 2014. During this time, water bird habitat and count protocols were distributed to cooperators on a variety of refuges, state wildlife management areas, and private lands in both the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways. The goals during the pilot phase were to validate and revise the bird and habitat monitoring protocols based on participant feedback and validation studies. Also, to inform the development of decisions during this pilot phase. Also, during the phase, we provided basic reports to the participants, and we developed, beginning of a centralized online database for participants. During this last year of the pilot phase in 2014, the revised protocol were subjected to an intense peer review process. And in January 2015, the protocols were approved as a national protocol framework for the inventory and monitoring of non-breeding water birds in their habitats. This protocol framework is compliant with the inventory and monitoring policy of the service and is intended to guide the use of these protocols by refuges. It enables them to develop site-specific protocols for their individual needs. With the newly revised protocol and approved framework, IWMM has concluded its pilot phase and is ready for wider implementation and can be used in all 4 major flyways. So to give you a bigger picture of what IWMM is ultimately striving for, we present you 2 measures of success for IWMM. These include managers at 3 spatial scales, the flyway, regional, and local, are using the resulting information to inform acquisition, resource allocation, and management decisions at their respective spatial scales. Another measure of success is that waterbird and habitat monitoring data during migration and wintering are standardized, creating a common currency across geographic scales and ownership boundaries. This will constitute an important step in developing full life cycle models for waterbird species and helps individual managers understand how their management contributes to the bigger picture of waterbird conservation. Finally, we want to conclude this section by highlighting why managers would use IWMM. Some of the reasons: to standardize their waterbird counts and habitat monitoring, to streamline the development of their own site-specific monitoring protocols, manage data, and generate reports via an online database. Also, to document the timing and amount of waterbird use and habitat conditions. And lastly, to link monitoring and management in an adaptive framework that provides feedback on how well their management actions are meeting their management objectives. That concludes the overview section, and I'd like to turn over the presentation now to Brian Loges to provide an update on the protocol revisions.
Okay, thanks, John, for the well-done and concise summary of this multi-layered project. It's not an easy thing to do with just a few slides, and it may take a minute or 2 for it to come over to me.
Should be coming to you.
Okay. Okay. So we should be on a lead slide with a marsh and a beaver lodge present. It may seem a little odd to kick off a discussion of a waterbird monitoring protocol without the mandatory duck in a marsh photo, but for IWMM, it is a bit appropriate because there is a strong component of monitoring habitat metrics in the monitoring program, and that's one of the things that makes IWMM fairly unique, because it aligns management action, tracking, and habitat condition measures with bird observation. Overall, the bird survey protocols for those participants who have been involved in the pilot season, really didn't change much in the protocol revisions. So the focus of this talk is going to be that the revisions to the habitat metrics that did change quite a bit. And for those who are new or aren't participating, there's additional training materials that will be available on the project website. There's a manual that was written in a way that you can just pick up the manual and get all the information you need to conduct surveys. So it's not really this isn't really a full-blown training per se for someone who's brand new to the program, but it's more of an update of the major revisions to the habitat monitoring protocol within IWMM. With that said, it's easy to get carried away with habitat monitoring. We did consider during the revision process adding some plot-based protocols to some of the vegetation measures that were being done. And you know, in the end, that the capacity constraints that we placed on this protocol just didn't really make that realistic. You know, we always wanted to provide rapid visual assessments of the quantity, quality, and availability of waterbird habitats, and once you start getting into plot-based protocols, that you have a really hard time of meeting that goal. So we kept it really general. They're all you know, visual assessments. But in the end, you know, even if you did plot-based protocols, sometimes you may not need all that detailed information. You know, maybe just the general approach is what you need to make better informed decisions regarding waterbird and wetland management. And so, you know, that's the gist of what drove the protocol revisions. And to clarify some terms, I'll try not to create hybrids of these terms. I'll refer to the manual and I'll refer to protocols. And the manual is basically the field methods for the IWMM monitoring program. And it's available on the website. It was derived from and is very, you know, it's identical to the National Protocol Framework without some of the additional information that's included in the framework. The framework includes all the nuts and bolts, and it's a foundation for the monitoring approach that IWMM is using. With that said, the National Framework is not a full-blown survey protocol, and that's, you know, that's a really important point to get across, that there's a difference between a national framework that's developed according to the Fish and Wildlife Service INM policy and a site-specific survey protocol. And, you know, for example, sampling objectives and spatial sampling design are things that, you know, the framework provides a foundation for folks to address those in a survey protocol framework, but those are things that can only really be developed at the survey level. And we are in the process of developing some, you know, some survey level protocols under the IWMM framework. And there's efforts in more than one region to develop those, and as those are completed, there'll be some good examples for other folks who are interested in conducting surveys using the IWMM approach. To get back to the revision process, we were fortunate to have an extended pilot season. You know, you can kind of put a positive spin on that. You know, IWMM was a grassroots effort, and it took a couple of years for us to get out of the pilot stage, but the plus side of that is we had several years of pilot data and some excellent feedback from participants. That's what really started to drive the revision process. And also we had funding from the NRPC for protocol development that was key to help us get through that protocol development process. And back in 2012, based on some of the feedback that we received early on from participants in the first 2 years of the pilot study, you know, a validation study was put together to, you know, examine the performance of the old vegetation metrics, and you know, this relied heavily on the biotechs that we had in a cooperative agreement with Upson Limited. We had several biotechs scattered across regions 3, 4, and 5, and worked them pretty hard in that fall of 2012, and ultimately ended up with a manuscript that has just been submitted recently and is still in the review process for that validation study. But the validation study was key for the protocol process, and when we worked on the revisions, we went back to that validation study frequently, and it really drove the revision process for us. If you look at what kind of metrics IWM is targeting with its monitoring, you know, we're basically hitting all those key variables for waterbirds. This was a literature review that was done a couple of years ago, and you know, it's easy to see how our metrics address these variables. Maybe the only one that's not directly included would be topography. Not everyone has good bathymetry for their management units. We had discussed, you know, some way of tracking that within the program, but didn't want to exclude too many people that didn't have that detailed topography information on their units. And in reality, the water depth, measures actually reflect what the topography of the unit is to some extent. So, it matches it up really well with this overview of all the key variables for water birds. And just real quick to hit the overview of what the changes are going to be. A little bit of delay in the slide shift. There we go. There's a few metrics that didn't have any major revisions. Pretty simple, straightforward things like percent ice cover, vegetation height. But most of the habitat metrics were revised in a fairly substantial fashion. We only added a new metric that was this chronic human disturbance, which is basically a reflection of the sanctuary status at the time the bird survey was completed. I'll get a little more detail on that later. So we really didn't have to add much. We just tweaked what was already there. So we had good coverage. We just modified based on the validation study and based on participant feedback during pilot years. One thing that did change quite a bit that active participants will notice is the schedule of the surveys. The veg survey is now a one-time. What we're calling the veg survey is a one-time assessment that's done late in the growing season when the majority of seed heads had developed for basically for moist soil systems. But it could be used in perennial dominated systems as well. But the idea is that composition and seed head production is not going to change much after the growing season ends. So we target the veg survey late in the growing season, and then all the other metrics that used to be on the old quarterly veg surveys are now on the bird surveys. And there is a little bit of a cost to that adds some time, but we did have one of our biotechs that tested this approach, and the first couple of rounds, he said it did add quite a bit of time to his bird surveys, but just like anything else, once you get in the groove and you learn those metrics, he said he was able to complete those metrics with his bird surveys with just adding a few minutes to each survey. So really not a major deal as far as the time required to take the survey. Most of the time to do the surveys is spent getting to the site anyway. So once you're there, recording these extra metrics really. And the huge advantage of doing this is things like interspersion and water depth, and of course ice cover. Those things can all vary quickly during the migration season. So we want those metrics to be recorded as close as we can for response that we're going to be comparing those metrics to. So I'll get a little more detail on the annual veg surveys, since these have changed quite a bit. The old approach was a kind of a straight up, we asked participants to record the top 4 dominants across the unit, and we learned from the 2012 validation study that there were some issues with that a lot of subdominant plants were getting included just to get a list of 4. A lot of times, especially in managed wetlands, you may only have 1 or 2 true dominant species, and then everything else in that unit is a subdominant. So there were some of those type of issues with that metric, so we've abandoned that approach, and we are now using a percent cover estimate for each plant species in the vegetated portion of the unit only. That's the key part of it, is that when you do these percent cover estimates, the surveyor will only be looking at the veg portion. So in this example, we have a unit that's pretty typical. There's a barrel along one of the levees, and so there's a fairly big piece of open water. Well, when you're doing your percent cover estimates for your plant species, you're ignoring that open water and just looking at the vegetated portion of the unit. And we do allow that number to exceed 100%. That's pretty typical in veg monitoring when you're putting percent cover on species because of canopy. There's vegetation often exists in canopies, so there's always some overlap between again, we're only looking at common species. We don't want to make this an exhaustive inventory where you're hunting down those things that there may only be 10 or so individuals in the vegetated area, and we cut it off at 5%. So if the plant is less than 5% cover, you can just ignore it completely. And really, to be 5% cover, that's pretty good. There's a lot of that plant out there at that 5% cover. And that's pretty straightforward. And if folks are familiar with veg monitoring, this is basically very similar to the Dobmeier approach, where you lay out a square meter quadrat in some veg community and estimate cover. The only difference is that our quadrats are huge because they're based on the wetland management units, but it's a similar approach. And we do encourage people to get out and walk through the unit at that time if they can, if they have the time. It's not required, but we do encourage these walkabouts. I don't think it's too much to ask, and most folks are probably doing this anyway. If they're putting effort to survey a unit and they're putting effort into management of that unit, they're getting out there and stomping around that unit probably late in summer sometime. The other key part of the annual vegetation surveys is the seed head assessment that is really targeting moist soil production. So those annual plants that are producing highly prized waterfowl foods. Right now it's for important waterfowl foods only, and it's categorical based on seed head size and seed head density. And I am going to turn it back over to John for a little bit, or John can take control for a little bit, and he's going to run through several slides that talk in detail about the seed head assessment and the guide that has been developed for the seed head assessment. So John, are you able to?
I'm right here, Brian. If you want, if you just advance the slides, I'll tell you when to move forward. I only have 3 or 4 slides to run through, but I just want to jump in and introduce the concept this morning of the seed head assessment guide that I helped develop as part of the Habitat protocol, and it's included in the IWMM monitoring manual. Next slide. One more.
Okay. A little bit of delay on this slide advance, but it's getting there.
So this is the reference to the seed guide. Next slide. Okay, as I noted in the previous slide, the seed head assessment guide is included in the monitoring manual, which will be available on the IWMM webpage. Currently it's in version 8, is the most current version, and it includes wetland plant species that have high food value to waterfowl. The species that are currently in the guide consist of those wetland plant species that were recorded on at least 50 or more vegetation surveys during the pilot phase during 2010-2014. So those are the ones we included in the guide initially. We are open to including more species in the guide as needed in the future. And this guide is intended to assist you, the field practitioner, with assigning seed head size and seed head density to a single species within a habitat patch or management unit. And as Brian mentioned before, the seed head categories that we've defined are small, average, and large. Next slide. Average seed head size for a particular species was derived from reviewing herbarium specimens, numerous wetland plant guides, and or expert knowledge. So within the guide, you'll see pages of individual species, and average seed head size for a particular species is indicated by a blue arrow on the picture to allow you to assess the seed head size for your plant being evaluated in the field. If the seed head matches with the blue arrow, it's considered an average seed head size. If it's smaller than the blue arrow, it's considered smaller than average. And of course, if it's larger than the blue arrow in length, or stature, it's considered larger. Seed head size is then recorded appropriately on the field data sheet for one of those three categories. Next slide. Next thing I want to introduce is assigning seed head density. By visually assessing the relative abundance of seed heads within a patch of each particular plant species being assessed, it considers the density of stems and seed heads in proportion to open ground, and we've assigned and created three seed head density categories as low, medium, and high. Next slide. So the guide is intended to assist you with assigning seed head density as follows. For a habitat patch with many seed heads, high stem density, and low bare ground, we assign that to the high seed density category on the field data sheet. Moderate to that, for a habitat patch with a moderate number of seed heads, moderate stem density, and moderate bare ground, it's assigned to the moderate seed density category. And lastly, for a patch that has very few seed heads, low stem density, and high bare ground, we assign that to the low seed density category. So that's just a little bit of an overview of the seed head assessment guide, and I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So we looked at the performance of this seed production index in a validation study that was completed last fall in Missouri, looking at some sites on some state land and some refuge sites and also some privately managed waterfowl clubs. And basically, the seed head index that we're working on is an expansion of the seed head index that Luke Naylor put together that was applied in the Central Valley of California. There's a paper from 2005 that describes that index, with the exception being the key point that John just talked about is, we're identifying up front what those average measurements are, so it's not a subjective estimate of the participant. There's a concrete reference for what those values would be to place the seed head as average or above or below average. So, some tweaks, but built on that Luke Naylor's approach. And so, we tested that against some quantitative estimates using one of Matt Gray's dot grid scanner approach for seed head production in last fall's validation study. And, this is not meant to replace detailed seed production estimates. If you have a project where you need, a pretty accurate estimate of pounds per acre and a kcal value to go along with that, this really isn't something that you'd want to use. It's rapid, it's a general assessment, and the goal is to be able to assign units to broad energetic classes. It's kind of like the good moist soil when you see it approach, but we want to be able to document that and place those units as either high, moderate, or low moist soil production, because seed production of moist soil can be so highly variable from year to year, and it would be nice to be able to have some kind of measure of the energy content of those units to compare to the bird use. And so we have done some preliminary analysis from the last fall's study and just looking at how the seed production index compares to the pounds estimates from the quantitative estimate using the Gray protocol. And we'll be working on the rest of that study this summer. This example in the graph is just from one individual. It was a multi-observer study, so it's going to be kind of fun to look at that and see how that also varies across individuals. And so we just wanted to highlight that those seed head metrics can be converted into a seed production index, and those would be presented. It can be summarized by unit and by species. So that's the key thing. If you have certain species that you're really interested in, your SPI can be it's created at the species level. The third metric that goes along on those annual vegetation surveys that are completed once late in the growing season is this percent tall edge. We've changed that to where in the past it was just strictly a field assessment. You just kind of eyeballed your unit and estimated the portion of the unit within 50 meters of trees greater than 6 meters in height. But now we allow folks to do that as just a heads-up exercise in GIS, and it's a real quick and dirty buffer exercise, and you can get your percent cover unit that way. It's not folks have recent aerial photography, and if something did change from what the most recent aerial photo was, it'd probably be pretty obvious when they're doing their surveys. So we just allow that to be done in the office using some IS platform. Okay, now we're moving to the bird surveys. And the IWMM protocol is it's a weekly or a biweekly survey. We give folks the option. Weekly, of course, bird, but biweekly is okay. Interspersion is one that we are now doing on the bird surveys, and this is one that we got a lot of participant feedback on in the first couple of years. It's kind of a squirrely thing to get a handle on. But we got lucky, and there was a recent paper that talked about different levels of interspersion, so we grabbed a hold of that 2013 reference, and revised the interspersion metric based on that reference, and it's still categorical, and it's based on the distribution of water if the unit is flooded, or bare ground if the unit's dry. So basically just non-vegetated versus vegetated, and the non-vegetated portion can either be in water or in bare ground, depending on the condition of the water levels in the unit. And so the classes are LS or M. Basically, L is large connected patches of water and bare ground, and S is small disconnected patches, and the M would be like a moderate or a mix kind of reference. And that's pretty basic, but it does allow us to kind of test what the interspersion is in the unit. And if you think about like a base, kind of easy to get an aerial image of what a baseball diamond would look like with an all-dirt infield. A well-maintained baseball diamond would certainly be in the low interspersion category. You'd have a big patch of bare ground and a big patch of vegetated in the outfield. But if you had a poorly maintained baseball diamond with a bunch of crabgrass in the infield and pocket gophers or something like that in the outfield, that would be an example of either an S or M, depending on how broken up those patches of bare ground were. And there's more explanation of this in the manual, but hopefully, this has been clarified quite a bit over the previous versions of and we clarified this through the pilot season, so it was developed over a couple of years, but we ultimately settled on this approach. And the other metric that we're recording on the bird surveys is percent of the unit in each broad habitat class, and so this includes all portions of the unit, whether it's vegetated or not, and we do not allow overlapping layers on this metric, so that, the percent proportions, must sum to 100, and senesced vegetation is included, obviously, because we're going to be doing this during the outside the growing season, so we have a killing frost, a lot of vegetation is not going to be actively growing anymore, but you'll still use it to identify proportion of the unit in these very broad habitat classes. And these broad habitat classes are defined based on the Cowardly classification system. And here's a short table that shows you how that crosswalk works. And so we don't get into a lot of detail about the height on the forest versus scrub shrub, for example, because that's already dealt with in the Cowardly classification system, and it's just a matter of referencing to that classification system for our habitat classes. Water depth was an old metric that was revised just on shallow water, and again, this is referencing back to that literature review on key wetland variables. And we all know how important shallow water is for waterbird use, and this corresponds with gill use also. And so there's some shorebird depths in there, and that's why it's such a fine resolution on the water depth, and it's really focused on shallow water only. Once you're over 10 inches, everything kind of gets lumped together as being in the deep end. And we encourage people to use gauges in combination with their ocular estimates. So for those folks who have nice detailed bathymetry maps for their units, certainly use those as a tool when available when you make these assessments. flood duration really wasn't changed much. The codes were refined, and we went with 30-day intervals based on what was in the literature, mainly in regards to decomposition of moist soil seeds. So, it's something that could be used to, if you're using your seed production index to assign some kind of energetic value to your units, you could use this flood duration metric to adjust for decomposition if you wanted to do so. This was a new one that was added. We had a disturbance, and we still retain the old disturbance metric, but that was basically just for disturbance that was observed while you were doing your bird survey. So, for example, if you have some hikers that were walking along the side of the unit at the same time that you're doing your bird count, you definitely want to note that, because that's going to influence the bird use in the unit for that survey period. But we also wanted to capture things that could influence bird use that would not be observed or wouldn't be obvious while you're doing your bird survey. So this, may require, if a volunteer is doing your surveys, the volunteer may need to check with the managers or a law enforcement person to figure out, what class matches up with what portion of the migration period. And we do expect this to change, especially on public areas, that have closures maybe during the fall, but then it'll open up after the local duck season closes. So there's a lot of those kind of things that we expect this to change during the survey period. So that's why we placed it on the bird survey form. And there's more detail on how those classes are laid out in the manual itself. Let's see, the other thing that we did in the protocol framework was to clarify the steps for delineating survey unit boundaries. For active participants, they know how important that is, but for folks who may be interested in starting up surveys using this approach, it's not something you want to change once you identified your unit boundary. That thing needs to be fixed. If you do have to change your unit boundary, you basically create a new unit and could potentially lose some of your other data. And so we want people to think about how they're going to define their survey units and get those pretty solid before they start doing their surveys. And we do have this constraint that you must be able to see greater than 70% of your unit. And you can use as many vantage points as you need and take as much time as you need to get around that unit, but you need to be able to see 70% of it. So if you have a survey unit that's pretty big and you just can't get to the perimeter of it, and you can't see 70%, it's just not gonna work for you. And there's some talk about, and we do allow aerial surveys in this protocol. So if that's your only option to see 70% of the unit is you have to get up in the air and do your surveys, and that's certainly allowed. Aerial surveys are an option for us, but either a bunch of perimeter points or aerial approach for bigger units, but you need to, that 70% is pretty critical. And we just ask folks to digitize and submit a polygon file of the survey unit once they've settled on those unit boundaries. And that's required for them to participate in the program. The other new thing that was added in the framework that really hadn't been dealt with during the pilot season was management actions. We'd like to have the ability to use this data in an adaptive management approach. And it's a pretty basic requirement that you need to track your management actions if you want to do that. So for now, we're asking people to keep a log of their management act by unit for the entire year. And I don't think this is going to be a big deal for anybody because almost everybody's already doing that. If they're putting effort into managing wetland units, they're probably keeping track of how many acres they're disking, how many acres they're flooding. We only ask that they do it at the unit scale, so it matches up with everything else. Everything in IWM is done at the management unit scale, so the impoundment scale. And we ask them to record spatial extent as percent of the unit. And we provide a laundry list of actions. And overlap is okay. you know, it's, we're not worried about things exceeding 100% of the unit. If you want to disk your unit 5 times, it's certainly going to exceed 100% if you disk it all every time. And we do also provide costs for each of these management actions that are in the laundry list. And when I refer to the laundry list, it's a list of about 80 or so management actions that was derived from the RLGIS database that the refuge system has developed. And you know, it's pretty detailed. Things like, you know, disking with a finished disk versus disking with an offset disk is, you know, down to that level of detail on the management actions. That's why there's so many of them. And we do expect people to group those actions when they get into more advanced decision support, which John's going to talk a little bit about later in the Mattamuskeet example. But basically, we just want to provide a standardized list with some cost estimates for consistency across refuges. We don't expect people to use those cost estimates for advanced decision support or budgeting at the, I'm sorry, we don't expect them to use those for budgeting at the refuge scale. You know, local cost estimates would be much better. We have to use some fairly broad cost estimates for the management actions in the protocol. And there's details and references for where those costs came from in the protocol itself. But the idea is that we have a consistent set of management actions and costs that everybody would be using to build from. And you know, with that, I think that highlights all the major changes to the habitat metrics. And as we were working through this, we were lucky to have a great biotech that worked with us in Missouri for the entire pilot season for IWMM. And you know, Matt was a great one to bounce things off of. And you know, we finally got to the point where you're saying it makes sense. So that was, you know, good affirmation for us as we're working through this protocol. And you know, I would like to thank everybody else that helped out during that process. And I would like to make a point that you know, we are going to probably be conducting in-person training at least in Region 3. I'm going to try to do that. For folks that are interested in joining or folks that are actively participating, especially to go over some of the vegetation metrics. I think it'd be good to get some folks together, look at the units all at once, and just to see what, you know, how different individuals perceive the protocol. So we'll be making that announcement later on, but obviously it'll be late in the growing season, so you know, I'm thinking probably September sometime, maybe late August, but probably push it back towards September, and maybe even early October. It all depends on, some of us are experiencing flooding right now, so I'm kind of waiting to see what the flooding is going to do and see if anybody local is going to have some seed production. And we also are going to have training materials online. So you know, always reference the site's web page for the latest on the training materials, and again, just check and follow the monitoring manual, which is reflective of the national protocol. And you know, it's written in a way that you can pick it up and read it and go out and conduct surveys. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to John.
All right, Brian, thanks a bunch for diving into the revised protocols. I'm going to switch gears on everybody, and we're going to move into the online database portion of the webinar. I just want to provide an overview. This is going to serve as a teaser to orient you to the tools and highlight the online database. These are going to be screen captures because the database is being built as we speak, and we're getting very close to completion. We do plan on giving a full webinar training on the database in the near future, and we'll be sending out announcements. But this is going to serve as a teaser. This is the home page. This is what it looks like right now for the online database for IWMM. In the past, during the pilot phase, we used the distributed access database. Individual users had to download the access database, use it at their local station, and then periodically they had to zip files and send them into the coordinator. Just, you know, kind of a cumbersome process. We really do want to move to this online one repository for data management for efficiency, obviously. So after you register and log in to the website, you arrive at this screen you can see that the screen refers to a project dashboard. This is where everything starts and emanates from here. And on this area, this project data dashboard will reflect, whether or not it's your refuge or your wildlife management area, maybe a piece of private property that you're managing. So this is where all things start. Across the top of the page, there'll be several tabs to navigate through the web page. We got data entry, downloads, reports, upload. So after you select on the main page the bird survey tab from the main page, you'll be able to select the first arrow there. You'll be able to select observation or the bird protocol that you used. It was a flush count or a ground count or aerial. And this will be the beginning of creating a record for a bird survey. You'll hit the start button. This is what the next screen looks like. You'll enter the date that you completed the bird survey. You'll indicate the data sharing level. All data that goes in first is raw data, and then as a manager of that data, you can QC it, quality control it, and then it's elevated up, and then it's approved and placed in the database as usable data. Of course, you're going to record the observer and some of the other environmental conditions that are required when you conduct a bird survey, temperature, the unit, wind speed, wind direction, sky code, the typical stuff. And then at the bottom, of course, you have a place to enter the species observed during your bird survey and the count, the total number of birds enumerated for that unit. This is a screen capture of how you would enter a habitat survey. Again, on the home page, you'll have a tab, to pull down tab that says Habitat Survey. So after you select the Habitat tab on the project dashboard, you'll be able to create a vegetation record here. And just some of the variables and some of the measurements that Brian just went over, you'll be entering them here. You'll identify the survey unit, the observer, the date, the start and end time of the survey. You're going to estimate that percent near tall edge, which you'll probably be doing that at a GIS platform or at your station. That's not necessarily done in the field unless that's the only way you can complete it. You'll be putting down the amount of vegetation in the unit, the visibility, what percentage of the unit you can see from your vantage point, or if you do a walkabout, you can indicate that. Then, of course, at the bottom, you're going to indicate those dominant species, and the plant species tab there is linked to the USDA National Plant Database. So it's a pretty comprehensive list of wetland plant species that are likely to occur in wetland systems in North America. And you'll be able to pull that down. And I covered the seahead size and density classifications, so you'll be able to enter your field observations right there. Also, Brian mentioned that as a result of the revision and the updating of the protocols, we have this management actions entry screen within the database to store your management actions. You can store them by unit. You can identify the unit that you are managing or you completed a management action on. You can select from a list of the type of action that was conducted, of course, the date you started that action and completed it, and then what percent of the unit was treated or affected by that management action. So here's a place to log away those management actions as needed over the course of an annual cycle. A really nice part of the database, of course, is where you can move from data entry to report generation. There's several reporting functions within the database that are being developed. The first one I want to cover is the bird survey reporting. You'll select your project or your area, and then you'll select the actual unit within that area, and then you'll select the protocols that you want to report the bird count for. So all the aerial surveys you did or all the ground counts, you can select those individually or select all counts, all bird survey counts. And you can filter by species. You can just plot or map or create a table, I should say, for all the species that you want count numbers for. And then, of course, you give your date range. So this is what it would look like. This is a bird count report. It's in tabular form, in table form right now. And it will generate bird count totals by unit and for a date range that you specify. And this is just one quick screen grab that I pulled out. So it's multiple ways you can report bird count data in the tool, the reporting tool. Next one I want to report out on is the generating a report for bird use days. Very similar approach. You'll click the tab on what type of report at the top, your area, and then the unit and the protocol upon which the data was collected, what type of bird survey protocol is applied, one species or multiple species, and the date range for which you want the bird use days calculated. And here's a report out, again, a table. This report presents bird use days by species for multiple date ranges and bird use days by hectare. So we're working on different representation of bird use data if we want by unit, by hectare, and that's being built into the generating reporting tool right now. Of course, all those are downloadable as PDFs. And the last reporting tool that I want to just highlight briefly here is the ability to generate migration curves for a particular area and unit. The bird count protocol you select, you select one species or multiple species and a date range, and then it produces a graphic report, a PDF, which gives you over a period of time that you've indicated. This one in particular is 5 different species were selected over about a 50-day period, and the migration curve of those species that occurred over that 50-day period are graphed here graphically. Okay, so let's see if I can catch my breath. I'm going to switch gears here. That was just the quick and dirty on the database and screen captures thus far. Getting very close to completion of that tool and that online database. We're pretty excited about that, and we'll be rolling that out, of course, in the near future. What I want to do now is switch to an application of the IWMM approach for the local scale and present the work that we've done to produce a local decision support tool for Mattamuskeet Refuge, National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern North Carolina. For decision support at the local scale, we developed what we call a multi-unit model. This model provides a tool for coordinating habitat management actions across multiple units, management units, to benefit waterbirds, that also considers management costs and other constraints. In fact, we developed a local decision support tools for 2 sites, Clarence Cannon National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri, and Brian Loges worked very closely with the staff there to develop a local support tool, and I work closely with Mattamuskeet in North Carolina using an SDM structured decision-making approach. We work very closely with the staff and the managers and biological staff at these refuges, and now what I want to do is just focus on the local decision support tool example that we developed for Mattamuskeet. Just as a way of a little background, Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge is about 50,000 acres. The majority of the refuge is comprised of a large freshwater lake and associated freshwater habitats. We focused on 14 individual management wetlands, freshwater wetland units that total approximately 2,000 acres, for which we developed a local decision support tool. So during the structured decision-making process, we had to identify the following roles and who fulfilled those roles in the setup of the decision support. I served as the proxy decision maker, was actually the refuge staff biologist for 8 years in the late 1990s at Mattamuskeet, so I was very familiar with the refuge annual decision-making process, and I had a pretty good working knowledge of the wetland dynamics and bird response for Mattamuskeet. And currently, I've been working with the refuge staff on developing annual management plans. I'm pleased to say we have a new refuge biologist at Mattamuskeet. She just started a few months ago, so we'll be incorporating her expertise and her involvement going forward. The second person involved in the setup for this was Dr. Brian Tavernia. He was the facilitator and the decision analyst for the setup for the local decision support tool, and he was our most recent IWMM science coordinator. He's moved on to work for TNC, but Brian facilitated this local decision support process. So Let's start at the top. First thing you need to do is define the problem statement. That statement is, how do we manage these 14 impoundments collectively on an annual basis for non-breeding waterfowl and migrating shorebirds? That was a goal. A management objective that we had for ourselves that we set was to maximize the use days collectively provided by these impoundments for our two focus groups. We wanted to maximize use days for waterfowl during fall migration and winter, or in the overwinter period. We also wanted to try to maximize shorebird migratory habitat for both fall and spring migrating shorebirds that use these habitats, these freshwater marshes. So the decision context requires that you define and or acknowledge the following elements. You have to define the decision maker, which we just talked about, the stakeholders, the other users of the refuge, and what influence they may have on your decision. Also, you have to consider the frequency and timing of this decision that you're trying to make. And typically on refuges and wildlife management areas, we're talking about an annual decision for management of these units, usually in early spring. A lot of these decisions are made and actions are taken into the field to manipulate habitat and control water levels. Also, what factors are constraining our decision? We have to make sure we consider all of those, as many as we could. And also just acknowledge, uncertainty. Like most things in the natural world, we've got environmental variation, and you have to be respectful of how that might affect your decision too. So the next thing we had to do in this SDM process was to select alternatives and actions. And what we defined as our alternatives and actions were hydro period was one way we described our actions, and this way we defined it was the annual timing and duration of water present within the impoundment. So we had to define the hydro periods that we were going to consider in our decision, and we ended up coming up with 7 distinct hydro periods that were possible under contemporary wetland management of moist soil units. So we defined those in the setup for the local decision support, and then we had to define broad vegetation manipulation categories that we could also couple with the hydro periods. So basically we came up with 3 broad vegetation manipulations that were possible for these 14 impoundments. We defined them broadly as mechanical actions, chemical actions, and burn, i.e. prescribed fire. Those are very typical actions in the broadest sense for freshwater marsh management. So the next step in the process was to identify the alternatives, which are different collections of the management actions that are possible across all these 14 impoundments. So actions for individual impoundments were created by combining hydro periods with various vegetation manipulations. We've got many different combinations, what we call portfolios, are possible. There's many different possible portfolios when you combine the various 7 hydro periods and 3 vegetation manipulations. So just here in the picture is just 2 possibilities of 2 different portfolios for applying management actions to those 14 units. Different colors just reference the combination of a hydro period and a vegetation manipulation. See how it starts to get complex real fast. Once the combination of hydro periods and vegetation manipulation portfolios were identified, all the possible portfolios, we needed to evaluate their respective benefits. Now, the total benefit of a portfolio depends on the total number of waterfowl and shorebird use days collectively provided by that combination. Therefore, we had to have some way to predict or come up with our prediction of use days, waterfowl and shorebird use days for each group that we are interested in, i.e. waterfowl, shorebirds. So how do we predict these use days for a given portfolio? In some cases, we were able to use existing data from Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge. We conducted typical ground-based and aerial surveys for waterfowl and some ground counts for migrating shorebirds. We also typically have completed late growing season transects in these managed units to get a handle on plant response and energy produced. So we had some empirical data we included. We also had to talk to former refuge biologists and staff and elucidate information from their knowledge on how bird response to these actions occurred. And then also we created a very simple influence diagram and how these actions and how the ecology of shorebirds and waterfowl would typically respond to those. And that allowed us to build a Bayesian belief network to capture those relationships. So the steps that we used to integrate the local scale model into the actual decision-making process went something like this. It occurred through the use of a quantitative shorebird and waterfowl use days predictions that were extracted from a Bayesian belief network. And we use that to analyze the different alternatives and portfolios and identifies which ones would maximize habitat delivery for both guilds of waterbirds, i.e. shorebirds and waterfowl, with respect to and consideration for labor and financial or budget constraints. And this analysis involved a 5-step process, which I don't have time to get into right now, but just want to reference it was an involved process. And ultimately, an integer program was written to run the decision support tool with staff inputs. And we had to get from the staff a budget constraint and a weighting of objectives. How much weight do they want to put on maximizing shorebird habitat in the spring and fall versus how much weight they wanted to put on wintering waterfowl, maximizing winter waterfowl use days. What we ended up with this year, I'm happy to say that the refuge adopted this approach, this adaptive management approach for this this growing season, this calendar year, and it's being implemented right now as we speak. This is the plan that was selected with the weights, and the output from the model produced the individual unit management actions and combinations of hydro periods, what's going to be conducted. And what will happen is that the refuge is going to be monitoring using the habitat and bird survey monitoring protocols this year to evaluate their management actions that were selected by the model decision support tool. And we'll be using the results of the habitat and the bird response based on this decision support output to update, parameter estimates in the model and as we move forward in adaptive framework. So pretty exciting stuff. Where are we with this? What's the status and next steps? So right now we've got this local decision support tool that's built. It's up and running, I'm glad to say. We used an SDM approach. The process has been completed and documented. We do have explicit testable models. And the integer program I talked about was developed by Brian Tavernia, and that can be shared. We have a 50-page case study report for this decision support tool, the draft. It's in draft form right now, and that can be shared as a draft. And Brian, myself, and a few other co-authors are working on a manuscript for peer review. So that concludes the local scale decision support tool, kind of a deep dive. And I'd like to transition now to Kevin. Kevin will be presenting on an example of collective data analysis and the aggregation of local scale data. So let me pass the presentation to you, Kevin.
Sounds great.
All right, should be coming your way, a couple seconds.
All right. So yeah, thanks for the background on the IWMM, Brian and John. I appreciate the setup there. And I'm going to sort of continue what John was talking about just a moment ago with another example of how we can apply the IWMM data and sort of just a way to show its utility for management in general. Our specific interests here, first I just wanted to acknowledge the people that helped me with this. Sean Crimmins was a postdoc here before me, and he's largely responsible for the model compilation, and the other members there and people from the IWMM tech team were also instrumental in putting this effort together. So I'm going to start with sort of just a brief overview of where our specific data came from, talk about how we're incorporating the data from IWMM into the models that we constructed, and what applications they have to management in a broader context. So our data came from these sampling locations, from these participating IWMM locations throughout the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways. You can see we've got pretty good geographic distribution here in terms of north, south, east, west. And we've included 8 species in our our evaluation here, all sort of from the Dabbling Duck Guild, and well represented in the data set, as you can see with the numbers of individuals that we've got here. So, we've got, again, good geographic distribution, solid number of individuals included, so we've got a pretty enviable data set to be working with here. Additionally, the sort of diversity of habitat types that we're dealing with is also quite complete. So we've got IWMM sampling locations throughout 15 different bird conservation regions that are shown here on this map. So we've got all of these factors sort of converging together to give us a good setting in which to couch these management considerations that we'll discuss in a bit. The overarching question that we're trying to answer with the models that we built is to identify the local level features that are sort of driving the broader continental scale patterns that we observe that are sort of depicted here in this predictive model. So what we do to create these models and to address that question of what's happening at the local level and identify which features are important to waterfowl abundance is take sort of groupings of IWMM variables that are collected throughout the surveys. So we've got 3 variables that are related to survey features, when the survey was conducted and where it was conducted. Well, I shouldn't say 3. These are examples. There are, as we've seen, more variables that are collected in each survey. But then we've also got habitat structure-related covariates and forage-related covariates, so, food preference stuff, types of vegetation that's available. We collect all of these variables into these 3 groups to create our 3 sort of base models. And they constitute the habitat structure and forage models that both have nuisance parameters contained within them, because that's going to be a feature of all of those different data types. And then we put all 3 of these individual models together to get a global model. So we group all of the variables into one global model to get an idea of the sort of total wetland dynamics that are occurring. So that's sort of a conceptual overview of that model. And our expectations for applying these models come from observations that we've seen of the timing of waterfowl migration events. So you can see that, across species, there's a pretty tight correlation between when these individuals are arriving and leaving at different areas. And so we expect that at these areas that they're arriving and leaving, there must be, or we suspect there might be, some features that are driving those dynamics that we see, and so we want to be able to identify what those are. So skipping over the sort of model compilation stage, which I can get into later if anybody is interested, but just to show sort of the output of these models from that conceptual overview, we grouped those models again into those 3 categories of forage, habitat, and survey covariates. And we wanted to see how important each of those covariate groups were to each individual species. And our hope, again, based on sort of the convergence of dabbling duck patterns through migration, was that these 8 species would show similar responses in terms of the relative importance of these covariates. So we could say that during the fall migration period in the Atlantic flyway, in that upper left quadrant there, we were hoping to see all 8 of these species grouped together in terms of the importance of each of those covariate groups. And we sort of see that for habitat and certainly for survey, but to a lesser extent for the forage covariates. And then the other 3 season and flyway combinations show an even lesser degree of convergence on patterns as a guild. So we started to see these species level interactions, but we didn't really see the guild level interactions that we were hoping for. And to sort of drive that point home and to provide an avenue to highlight those species level interactions and what we can do with those, we created a principal component analysis, which boils down those 4 season flyway combinations into the 2 most principal components in the combined sense. And what we have found is that with these 2 principal components, PC1 and PC2, they're more highly correlated with season than with flyway. So flyway seems to matter less and was a little more consistent, and seasons had more of the variation within them. So principal component 1 can sort of be thought of as fall, and principal component 2 can be thought of as spring. So if you're interested in gadwall, for example, and you wanted to know how they interact with habitat-related covariates, we see that that point lies to the right of 0 along the principal component 1 axis. So that means that they're positively related or positively correlated with habitat structure covariates. And similarly, they fall below 0 along principal component 2, which again is spring. So that means during the spring migration period, they're negatively associated with habitat structure covariates. So what we would expect from this is that, if you were to increase those habitat covariates, if you increase water depth or vegetation cover, you would expect to see an increase in gadwall abundance in the fall. Whereas in the spring, if you were to increase any of those, you would expect to see a decrease in gadwall abundance. So what this can do, even though we don't see, again, this grouping of species for an individual covariate group, is we can get a sense of what the sort of collateral actions will be for any targeted management plan. So if again, your goal here is to manage for gadwall, and you know how they respond to habitat structure during fall and spring, you would expect to see sort of opposite patterns for something like the northern shoveler, which is up in that upper left-hand quadrant, for its reaction to habitat structure. So you would be able to develop these expectations that, if we increase water depth, we should see an increase in gadwall abundance, but a decrease in northern shoveler abundance. And if you can weigh those costs and decide that, that's acceptable, then maybe you can push forward with that management plan. But if you can't, then you would, find alternatives. We sort of were a little frustrated by that result initially. We were really hoping to see, some similarities across the guild that would make management a little easier. But when we thought about it from the context of David Tillman's resource competition theory, it began to make a little more sense in that context, that whenever you have, 2 or more resources that multiple species are competing for, the only way you're going to get coexistence of all of those species in any stable sense is if they're using or depleting those resources in certain ratios that enables all of those species to have access to those resources. If one species is better at depleting a certain resource than all the others, then, resource X that they're targeting is going to be at such a low abundance, none of those other species can exist, and they'll disperse. So that's sort of our theory for why we're seeing all of these species coexisting at the sampling locations we had. They're able to stay there because they're relying on different parts of the environment, whether they're queuing in on habitat structure or forage availability at different times of the year. And so again, we can sort of see that as we look back at the whole picture here, that, we don't see, for instance, all of the habitat-related covariates grouping together. So again, we don't see those guild-level patterns. And we see this general spread across this plane where individual species sort of have differential responses to each of these covariate groups. So just like we had those trade-offs from that ecological perspective where, if one species maximizes their ability to use resource 1, then they're, less capable of using resource 2. We have a similar trade-off scenario from a management perspective, where every dollar you spend toward management priority 1 is a dollar you can't spend toward management priority 2. And so we need some way to sort of weigh the cost benefits of each of those priorities. And these local level models can, to a certain extent, help us identify, what the, again, collateral actions will be for each of those policies on the suite of species instead of looking at it on a species-by-species scale. And I also want to stress that these models were created with the sort of old protocols. And as we have these new protocol changes here, going forward, we'll have data on management actions. And so eventually we'll be able to incorporate those into models like these to not only be able to make predictions about local waterfowl abundance, but make predictions about how management actions are going to affect local waterfowl abundance. So, certainly one of the concerns people might have is if I make these changes and I still don't, so for example, if I increase water depth in the fall and I still don't see an increase in gadwall like these models suggested I would, is that because of something, that has happened because of what I did, or is it sort of a flyaway or regional issue that there are things going on in other locations that are preventing the response that I expected to see. And so again, once we have more data on management actions, we can begin to incorporate those and make more predictions in that context. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that these results that we have found may only be indicative of patterns that are occurring in sort of the upper Midwest, or the upper central portion of the Mississippi Flyway, and then the Atlantic coast along the Atlantic Flyway. We've got these big gaps in areas where we don't have locations that are participating in the IWMM, so we can't justifiably extrapolate our results to there just yet. But hopefully, as we look at things like this and begin to identify areas that we can prioritize for increased participation in the IWMM, we'll be able to fill in those gaps as well. So thanks for listening to that, and I think that's the end of the whole webinar. So if I guess I'll turn it back over to whoever to start fielding some questions on this.
Oops, sorry about that. I was on mute. Thank you very much, Kevin. Greatly appreciate it. And I think you can just go ahead and turn it over to me.
Okay, I think John is still in control, so if you can.
Or John can keep it. I don't think we really have any more slides except for showing our contact info.
Yeah, we have 2 slides, so it's all yours.
Okay. Let's see if I've got it. Okay, well, while I'm waiting to see if this is going to come through, I just wanted to make a couple of remarks. First, I wanted to say it's been our pleasure to share this webinar with you all today. Aside from the technical difficulties that we had, I want to apologize for that. We, I think, would be more than happy to do a second session if enough people weren't able to get on this one. So I think we'll have to get together as a group and figure out how we're going to contact folks and find out who missed it and how much interest there is. But I guess if you talk to anyone that you know missed it, you could certainly convey to them that they might want to contact me, and I will find out how much interest there is for a second session, and I'll get that organized if necessary. I also wanted to thank the presenters today, John, Brian, and Kevin. Really appreciate it, and I wanted to thank Tim Jones for providing the technical support and getting this running for us. And I wanted to reiterate that in closing, I want you all to just keep in mind that IWMM really represents a grassroots effort for the ultimate benefit of waterbirds and the habitat they depend on. And the effort we really wanted to emphasize today has moved from concept to application. So we really want to encourage you to become more involved in IWMM and to use the tools that we've developed if you think they're going to meet your waterbird needs. We now want to open the rest of this session up for your questions, and we will also be available after the call today to answer questions as well. And if I'm going to, I've put up our contact information in case you want to reach any of us. Our website, we've got a new website that's going to be available very soon, but it's not quite finished yet, so the best way to reach any of us today is through the information on the screen here. Kevin's information I see is not on the slide, but we can get that information if you have questions for him. So with that, I'd like to open it up and see if there are any questions to any of the speakers.
So, Linda, we have one question from posted in the chat room that asks, when should we transition to the new protocols?
Well, our plan is to have the new protocols will begin with the next season of data collection, so fall of 2015. When you go out to start your new data collection, we want you to use these protocols. So for some people that might be as early as July 1st, not for very many, but for others it might be a little bit later, but when you go out to start collecting your 2015 fall data, you'll be using the new protocols.
So if folks have questions, they can unmute, or I'm not sure, Tim, if you have control to unmute, but we can field questions, 3 or 4 of us, not a problem.
And if we still have data in the old database, can we still submit that and it would be rolled up into the online system? And then we would obviously start submitting online in the future?
That's correct. If you, we've just initiated a data call for the recent year's data, and we will have a historical database that has all of the data collected with the old protocols in that AKN database. And we will let you know when the new database is ready for you to start entering your 2015 data collected with the new protocols.
Hello, this is Enan Adams in Region 6. And I've been in and out, so I apologize if this has already been addressed, but how are you accounting for hunting disturbance during the fall, or are you? And was wondering, if not, how do you intend to in the future if you think it's impactful on the response variable?
Brian, do you want to take that one?
I can handle that one. Yes, we do account for hunting as a disturbance. It's in that chronic human disturbance metric that was added in the protocol revision, and those are completed every time they do a bird survey. So, you know, for some survey units, that status is going to change, obviously. Capture that on the bird surveys.
I tried to put that table up, Ryan. I think Class 3 will try to address that.
Yep.
Is that just on the unit scale, or are you looking at the amount of disturbance around the refuge as well?
That's at the unit scale, so it's just for the survey unit.
Okay.
And 3 is basically, you know, a managed hunting program, you know, similar to what a lot of the states do. And then, like a 5 would include firearms hunting, but no effort to control the intensity of the hunting. So it's just like a wide open hunting area. So there actually are 2 different classes to cover hunting during the fall.
And we were asked whether a recording of this would be made available. Yes, we did record this, and it will be made available on our website. It usually takes a couple of days to get it from Verizon, and then we'll edit out part of our technical difficulties this morning and get it posted on the website.
And as I noted, the website will be changing soon. We're targeting sometime within the next week or so to have that new database at least being, or excuse me, the new website launched. So if you get onto the NING site, you should still be able to access this information, but we'll let you know when that new website is up and running.
So I'm getting some other questions in the chat box that we'll try to address here, and so we were asked whether we could, whether we would post a copy of the PowerPoint slides. I think that's possible, right, Linda? Others?
Yes,
John?
we can do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll make those available. Probably not. I think it's a pretty large file, so probably not via email, but we'll make a link to the slides from today's presentation available. And then somebody else asked who designed our database. We've contracted that with Point Blue. It used to be Point Reyes Bird Observatory. They're doing several of the Avian Knowledge Network nodes around the country. They've got some world-class high-end database developers from the Silicon Valley that work for them, and that's who we're using, and so it will be a node of the AKN.
And I placed a copy of the website and the URLs up there at the top for the current IWMM website, where you can get more information. Like Linda said, we'll be transitioning to a new website It's in development right now, and we'll send out a broad to that effect.
Any other questions? We have certainly got a few more minutes where we could discuss just about any aspect that you all might be wondering about.
Linda, this is Cindy Barrett. I'm representing Refuge in Region 2.
Hi, Cindy.
Is there a deployment plan for deploying the protocol to the other flyways?
Well, at this point, we are simply letting individuals know that the protocol are available. There's a national protocol framework in place, and refuges in Region 3, for instance, are working on their IMPs and will identify, if they identify IWMM as a priority survey, then they will move towards adopting that survey and developing a site-specific protocol. You know, we have a whole group of refuges, I'm sure you're aware, in Region 2 that are now developing site-specific protocols based on the national protocol framework. So it's kind of moving at different paces in each of the regions, depending upon where people are with their needs.
And if a particular refuge wants to start at the grassroots level, who do they go to get codes?
I'll get those to you, Cindy. I apologize for not getting those to you earlier, but it's just been a hectic spring.
I understand, Tim Jones. Thank you very much.
Yep, I'll be in touch.
We're very excited.
Great. We're very excited to hear about that.
This is Melinda Knutson, and I'm wondering about if Kevin, I thought the material you presented was really interesting. I think we would need to translate it a little bit more for our managers. Do you think that's possible? You know, that we could, you know, for the particular recommendations for each of the species, you know, is more complicated than you thought. It's going to require more translation, even for somebody like me, and certainly for those out there on the field stations to use that information that you came up with. Gotcha.
Yeah, I think, and especially as we consider going forward how we can include the data involving sort of management actions, I think we can sort of tighten up the models to make the output a lot more user-friendly and more easily interpretable.
Great, thanks. I think that it's, you know, it's really interesting stuff, and anyway, I'll follow up with you.
Yeah, sure.
Later.
Any other thoughts or questions? Well, I guess I'm not hearing any other comments or questions. So hopefully you all have information on how to contact us. And feel free to do so if anything occurs to you after this webinar. And once again, I thank all of you for devoting the time to this today. And just stay tuned. There'll be more information coming very soon.